In the mid-14th century BC, Syria stood at the crossroads of the great powers, a region caught between a weakening Mitanni, an apathetic Egypt, and a rapidly revitalizing Hittite kingdom. In a remarkably short span, a single remarkable lifetime, the political landscape was totally reshaped, and a new balance of power emerged, one that defined the rest of the Late Bronze Age. Yet the very events that transformed the region remain some of the most debated in Near Eastern history. What actually happened during the Syrian campaigns of Suppiluliuma, the great king of the Hittites? And can we rectify our sources which seem to disagree about the sequence of events? Let's dig in. From the mid-15th to the mid-14th century, the Hittite Empire was on the verge of collapse after a period of protracted decline. This was arrested with the accession to the Hittite throne of Tuttulli III, followed by his son, Suppiluliuma I. As a quick aside, this is not going to be a comprehensive examination of Suppiluliuma and his entire reign. We want to focus on the strategy and execution of his Syrian campaigns, the variously called Great Syrian War, First Syrian War, and 1 Year War, as well as the Second Syrian War, 6-Year War, and Hurrian War. We are going to examine the somewhat dubious circumstances in which he came to the throne. We aren't going to look at his reconquest of the Hittite heartland. We won't get into his, let's say, tumultuous personal life. We want to look at just the few short years in which he took control of Syria. Also, this picture is often shown in discussions of Suppiluliuma. And this is a Suppiluliuma, but it's not this Suppiluliuma. This is the depiction of a 9th century king of the Syro-Hittite kingdom of Patan, not the 14th century ruler of the Hittites. We don't have any contemporary depictions of Suppiluliuma, we only have his seal impression. We do have a lot of textual sources which date to the reign of Suppiluliuma, which can be used to reconstruct the history of his reign. However, not all of the sources are in total agreement about the sequence of events of his reign. The main sources for this period are treaties Suppiluliuma signed, especially his treaty with Šattiwaza of Mitanni, but also his treaties with Ugarit, Amurru, Nuhashe, and Aleppo. There are also a few Amarna Letters which likely, though not certainly, relate to his campaigns. And there are some letters recovered from Qatna which provide non-Hittite perspectives on his campaigns. And then there are also some texts from his son's reigns, especially the Deeds of Suppiluliuma, or CTH 40, and the report of Hattusili III on the campaigns of Suppiluliuma, or CTH 83. And these all give some details of his various campaigns. However, again, not all of these texts are in agreement, and there's debate as to how to best interpret some of these sources. And what follows is our best reconstruction of the events, though we will address where there's room for different interpretations. In the mid-14th century, Suppiluliuma, with his father, began to restore the Hittite homelands to Hittite control. And while the Hittite royal family resumed control over their ancestral seat and had some victories over enemies in Arzawa, against the Kashka in the north, and even against Azi and Hayasa to the northeast, they were still threatened on nearly all sides, and Suppiluliuma would need to campaign in Anatolia throughout most of his reign. In the wider world, the kingdom of Mitanni dominated the Copper Valley and inland Syria, while the Egyptian New Kingdom dominated the Syro-Levantine coast with a de facto border in the Orontes Valley. The Mitannian kingdom was experiencing internal strife with a dynastic dispute. One Tushratta had been placed on the throne, replacing his brother, but there was another claim to the throne, one Pirhi, who took the throne named Artatama, who also styled himself king, creating civil strife within the kingdom. And it was under these circumstances the great king Suppiluliuma decided to act. His first action was to test the waters against the Mitannian client kingdom of Ishua. Ishua was a small kingdom in what is now Elazig province in Turkey. My apologies to those who speak Turkish for my pronunciation. It is situated in a curve in the Euphrates to the northwest and south, with mountains to its east. It sat on a well-traversed trade route and controlled vital crossings across the Euphrates as the river had unfavorable currents this far upstream. Suppiluliuma's initial foray may have actually been defeated, as Tushratta claims to have assisted Ishua against Hatti in the Amarna Letter EA 17. It is likely in the aftermath of this setback, Suppiluliuma made a formal treaty with Tushratta's rival claimant Ardatama, recognizing him as a great king and equal. And shortly after that, Suppiluliuma set out again, likely with a greater sense of what he was up against and, depending on how one interprets the sources, a clearer strategy. Most scholars recognize Suppiluliuma was set on weakening the kingdom of Mitanni. It's not clear if he set out to fully subjugate Mitanni's client states or simply to weaken the kingdom. But it's almost certain one of his clear goals was to not provoke Egypt, even trying to isolate Mitanni from Egypt. And most of the itinerary of the Great Syrian War is not widely disputed. Some scholars dispute the sequence of events and think certain events typically associated with the Great Syrian War ought to be moved to the Second Syrian War, but most of the debate relates to the chronology, which again we'll get to in a moment. Suppiluliuma could cite two distinct casus belli which triggered his first campaign into Syria. First, there was an anti-Hittite uprising in the land of Ishua. Secondly, the king of Mitanni invaded the kingdom of Nuhasha in Syria to attack a king friendly to the Hittites, who, Suppiluliuma claims, called for Hittite aid. Suppiluliuma was, this time, better prepared. He invaded Ishua, defeated it, and secured it for the Hittites. From here, he moved south to take the land of Alsha. From Alsha, he plundered the region of Shuta. He continued south to Washukani, the capital of the kingdom of Mitanni. Many scholars associate it with the modern ruin of Tel Fekheria, but Suppiluliuma says he did not face Tushratta in battle. Instead, he found the city abandoned. Tushratta did not come against me for battle, he reports. He says he took cattle, sheep, horses, and other plunder from the city and took it to Hatti. It's not clear why Tushratta abandoned his capital, though there are several viable explanations. He may have been unable to mount a resistance if Suppiluliuma struck as quickly as he claims. The Mitannian army may have been preoccupied with Nuhasha, or perhaps dealing with his pretender to the throne. We don't know for sure. From Washukani, Suppiluliuma crossed the Euphrates again and came to Aleppo. We aren't told explicitly how Aleppo capitulated, if it was a siege or if the city surrendered after Hittite armies suddenly appeared at their gates. After Aleppo, the land of Mukish, governed from the city of Alalak, also surrendered. This is not stated in the treaty with Šattiwaza of Mitanni, but many scholars believe that it was while in Mukish that Suppiluliuma concluded a vassal treaty with Nikmadu of Ugarit. The historical prologue of his treaty with Ugarit makes mention of hostilities between Ugarit and Mukish, Nuhashe, and Akiteshep of Nia. And we know Akiteshep of Nia was active during the First Syrian War. While in Mukish, the king of Nia, a man named Takua, came and surrendered. However, his brother, Akiteshep, raised a revolt in Nia, and along with the kingdom of Arahati, fought against the Hittites. It's possible the kingdom of Qatna also joined the coalition, but it isn't entirely clear. Suppiluliuma defeated this coalition and sent the rebels, their chariots, and the city of Qatna to Hatti. This is why some suggest Qatna may have been a part of the coalition. But the city wasn't destroyed yet, so maybe what he's referring to is that the army was defeated and the plunder associated with it is what was sent back to Hatti. Following the defeat of Akiteshep, the Hittites subdued Nuhashe, placed a new king on the throne, and placed him to rule in Ukulzat. It's not stated, but given that the appeal from Sharupshi of Nuhashe may have been the stated reason for the entire war, it's unclear why he invaded Nuhashe. It's possible that the kingdom had concluded a peace with Mitanni in the interim and so was now hostile to Hatti, resulting in a Hittite correction. The Hittites fought the king of Kadesh in battle, but Suppiluliuma is clear to note he did not attack into Kadesh as it was a vassal of Egypt at the time. He did, however, defeat the army of Kadesh and sent its king into exile in Hatti. We do note that the prince of Kadesh was allowed to return and signed a vassal treaty with the Hittites, bringing the city officially out from under Egyptian control. From there, Suppiluliuma claims he went to the land of Apina, which is a vaguely defined region south of Qatna, which included the city of Damascus and the land around it. He claims to have defeated Apina and, quote, brought all of these together with their land and their possessions to Hatti. Because of the presumptuousness of King Tushratta, I plundered all of these lands in 1 year and brought them to Hatti. This concluded the First Syrian War. Much of Mitanni was subjugated. though certainly the core region of Mitanni was mostly untouched, as was the client kingdom of Carchemish. He also did not attack any of the coastal regions, which were more securely within Egypt's orbit. Following this war was an intermediate period of relative peace. During this time, Suppiluliuma returned to Anatolia and fought against the traditional Hittite enemies there for up to 15 to 20 years. It's possible it is during this period that Aziru, ruler of Amuru, switched his allegiance from Egypt to the Hittites. The historical prologue of that treaty cites previous conflicts between the Hittites and most of Syria, and in the midst of that, Aziru came to swear fealty to Suppiluliuma. It's not clear which conflict exactly this refers to, but it's likely prior to the 6-year or Hurrian War, which came a few years later. Earlier in his reign, Suppiluliuma had appointed his son, Telepinu, as priest in Kizuwatna. But now he was moved to become ruler, or king, of Aleppo, and ruled there like a vice-regal king on his father's behalf. However, in the years between Suppiluliuma's campaigns, Syria remained unstable. Egypt was not happy it had lost Kadesh, and the Mitannians sought to regain control over their lost client kingdoms. And so Telepinu was left to assert as much control as he could. He chipped away at the territory of Carchemish, but he could not stave off attacks from both Carchemish and Mitanni indefinitely. Telepinu had been recalled to Anatolia to celebrate religious festivals with his father, and while he was absent, Mitanni and Egypt launched coordinated attacks. This would lead to the 6-year war, or also known as the Hurrian War. In this conflict, Suppiluliuma divided his forces to address the numerous threats. A pharaoh had attacked the city of Kadesh. However, Hittite army under the command of trusted generals regained Kadesh, likely through diplomatic means, and then counterattacked into Egypt, invading the Egyptian client kingdom of Amki or Amuk, roughly equivalent to the Bekaa Valley. Elsewhere, the crown prince Arnuwanda, with his uncle Zita, attacked into Mitanni. And this freed Suppiluliuma to besiege the city of Carchemish. It was while besieging the city the king received a letter informing him of political developments in Egypt, wherein the pharaoh had died and his queen was insecure on her throne and was in need of a husband. She requested a Hittite prince for a husband, which would have formally bound the two kingdoms. The Hittite king sent an envoy to Egypt to discover the truth of this, and in the meantime Suppiluliuma finished his siege of Carchemish and put his son Piyasili as king of the city. He took the throne name of Shari Kush, and Suppiluliuma elevated the kingdom of Carchemish to the chief viceregal kingdom in Syria, while also making Telepinu priest in Aleppo, a city which had a long history of being the most important cult center in all of Syria. When Suppiluliuma found the pharaoh had in fact died, he sent his son Zenanza to Egypt to marry the queen, but he never made it. He was killed en route. This prompted retaliatory strikes against Egypt, but this likely did not result in long-term acquisition for the Hittites. Instead, it brought a plague of tularemia back to Anatolia, which would ultimately claim the lives of Suppiluliuma and his son Arnuwanda. Prior to these retaliatory strikes in Egypt, though, Mitanni had been fully subjugated. Šattiwaza, whose vassal treaty has been used to reconstruct the sequence of events, married a daughter of Suppiluliuma and was placed on the throne of a much weakened Mitanni. While the Hittites were seizing the Orontes Valley, Alsha and Assyria divided eastern Mitanni amongst themselves. With the aid of Hittite soldiers, Mitanni was rescued from Assyrian depredation and was made into the rump state of Hani-Galbat, which was, until its dissolution, a vassal of the Hittites, concluding Suppiluliuma's conquest of Syria. Now, most of this sequence of events is not widely disputed. However, there are some outstanding questions about these wars. For example, some place the vassalization of Ugarit during the Second Syrian War and not the First. Others would place the vassalization of Amuru after the Second Syrian War and not in between. But other more consequential questions relate to chronology. Specifically, when did these wars occur and how long did they take? And these may not seem like particularly engaging questions, but I think they actually matter when it comes to how we understand Suppiluliuma. As for the first question, when did these wars occur? There are enough clues and synchronizations with other kings that we can get a pretty granular picture. Most scholars date the Great Syrian War to early in the reign of Suppiluliuma, perhaps the 4th or 5th year, but certainly no earlier than his 3rd. And while we know Suppiluliuma was contemporary with Tushratta and certain pharaohs, it's not clear how his reign best synchronizes with their reigns. He may have briefly overlapped with Amenhotep III, but was certainly contemporary with Akhenaten. And scholarship is moving towards seeing no co-regency between Amenhotep III and his son, Akhenaten, or at least not a long one. So most scholars would accept Suppiluliuma ascending the Hittite throne late in the reign of Amenhotep III, which still works with the chronologically significant Amarna Letter EA41. Another chronologically significant text is EA75, written by the Biblian king and Egyptian vassal Hatti. In it, he reports to Pharaoh, almost certainly Amenhotep III in this case, about a Hittite victory over Mitanni. Some have tried to read this as an account of the First Syrian War, but this is not likely. Instead, we may interpret this as an early conflict between the Hittites and Mitanni in the years leading up to the First Syrian War. It may have been a relatively insignificant skirmish which was exaggerated by the Biblian king, something which would not have been out of character for him. It may refer to either early skirmishes between Suppiluliuma and Mitanni early in Suppiluliuma's reign, or perhaps before he even ascended to the throne. And this letter may be contemporary with EA24, written by the Mitannian king Tushratta, which mentions conflicts with an enemy, usually understood to be the Hittites. And if these refer to events early in the reign of Suppiluliuma, he would have ascended the throne in the 35th or 36th year of Amenhotep III, with the Great Syrian War beginning no earlier than his third year, but likely later than his third year. We know that he was campaigning in Arzawa in his second year, so he cannot have started the Great Syrian War until after that. Letters sent to Akhenaten by Tushratta, likely coming in his fourth or fifth year, make no mention of Suppiluliuma's attack, but are trying to reify good relations between Egypt and Mitanni, which may indicate Mitanni expected an attack but had not come yet. The Great Syrian War then may have started perhaps during Akhenaten's fifth or sixth year, perhaps beginning in the late summer or fall of 1345 with an invasion of Ishua. The dating of the Second Syrian War is a little bit easier as it correlates to the death of an Egyptian pharaoh. This is sometimes suggested to be Tutankhamun, though as with all things relating to this subject, this is debated. It all depends on who the pharaoh identified as Nefer or Iya is in the Hittite sources. The death of this pharaoh occurred while Suppiluliuma was besieging Carchemish. EA170 describes an attack in the Bekaa Valley, which many correlate with the Hittite attack in the Second Syrian War. This would likely eliminate Tutankhamun, given the dating of the Amarna archive, leaving either Akhenaten or the short tenure of Smenkhare as this mystery pharaoh. As for the length of the 1-year war, you may be surprised that there's debate as to how long the 1-year war lasted. Now, there are definitely scholars who accept the claim of 1 year. However, other scholars think it lasted a bit longer. For example, Violetta Cordani has suggested it lasted not 1 year, but closer to 5. And this is based not only on inferences about late Bronze Age logistics, but on literary traditions. She notes that much of the historical reconstruction of the campaign comes from the historical prologue of Suppiluliuma's treaty with Mitanni. And it's important to note that historical prologues are a standard part of Hittite treaty formulas. In the prologue, Suppiluliuma recounts the sequence of events which led to the signing of the treaty, including his conquest of Syria, where he concludes, "Because of the presumptuousness of King Tushratta, I plundered all of these lands in 1 year and brought them to Hatti. From Mount Lebanon and from the far bank of the Euphrates, I made them my territory." That's pretty straightforward. This is why the Great Syrian War was called the 1-year war in the first place. However, it's not clear if maybe we should see the 1 year as part of an aggrandizing motif where significant accomplishments are compressed into a short time span. If we assume the Hittite text KUB 34.23 refers to the beginning of the Great Syrian War with the Hittite invasion of Ishua, it's likely the campaign began in either late summer or early autumn. If that's the case, it's theoretically possible the Hittite army marched from Ishua to Kadesh in one campaigning season, given the route outlined in the treaty which we documented earlier and given a pace of 20 to 25 kilometers a day. But if this is the case that it all happened in one campaigning season, it's more likely that this campaign was like a sustained raid more than a real conquest seeking to establish lasting control. It may have been more of a series of opportunistic razzias that were intended to weaken Mitanni. And there are some ways to interpret the text this way. However, the text does seem to point toward Hittite interest in actual conquest. For example, he set out to politically reorganize conquered territory with elites friendly to the Hittites placed on thrones, and he took time to actually defeat organized resistance, as with the king of Nia. And this would not have been entirely necessary unless long-term conquest was the goal. And Qardani has also noted, with many following her lead, that the historical prologue of CTH 51 has stylistic similarities to other Hittite annalistic history texts, especially Mursili's 10-year annals. And many even believe that Suppiluliuma recorded the events of his reign in a similar kind of annalistic document, now lost, which was likely the source for the historical prologue of CTH 51 as well as CTH 83. If this is the case, and the historical prologue of CTH 51 is based on a more annalistic tradition, the prologue is likely an abbreviation of a more fleshed out telling of the events. For example, in Mursili's 10-year annals, the war loot from campaigns is always reported as being returned to Hattusha by the king himself at the end of the campaigning season. War loot is reported 4 times in the prologue to CTH 51, which may point to a length of 4 years for the First Syrian War. It would suggest Suppiluliuma returned to Hattusha after his victory at Washukani, after his victory over Akiteshep, after his victory over Nahasha, and after his victory over Kadesh. With the preliminary campaign against Ishuba, the total length of the war would come to 5 years. The claim that it all happened in 1 year is not then a summary statement of the entire war, but simply eliding it from each mention of war loot and then adding it only once at the end. But this is not without its issues. Qardani herself notes it seems unlikely, given Suppiluliuma's hesitancy to get Egypt involved until much later in his reign, that he would campaign 1 to 2 whole years right on Egypt's border. Now, you may be wondering, why does the length of the war matter? This is a pretty esoteric issue. Why are we camping out on it? And that's a valid question. But these niche debates about chronology matter because they shape how we evaluate Suppiluliuma as a strategist and statesman. Was his Great Syrian War a masterclass in strategy and diplomacy that was carefully crafted and expertly executed, or was it an opportunistic raid that kinda got out of hand? On the one hand, if this was a multi-year campaign, it appears to have been a well-coordinated attack with clear strategies. Weaken Mitanni, subordinate the affluent Orontes Valley and enter Syria, all while not antagonizing Egypt. And that was largely a success, barring the attack against Kadesh. Vassals were made, friendly kings were placed on thrones, and Syria was effectively brought under Hittite control. If this was a single-year blitzkrieg, it's less likely this was a well-strategized campaign and was more likely a just wildly successful raid. But then we ought to be more skeptical attributing a goal of conquest and long-term subjugation to a raid. Personally, I find Qardani's analysis to be compelling. This appears to me to be a well-organized and strategized campaign with clear aims and obvious steps taken to accomplish those aims. Especially when we consider the successful campaigns within Anatolia, it looks to me like Suppiluliuma knew what he was doing, and we ought to consider his Great Syrian War as one of the great campaigns of the ancient world. In the end, whatever reconstruction we adopt, whether the Great Syrian War was a single, astonishing sweep or a sustained multi-year effort, the results were unmistakable. Syria emerged from these campaigns fundamentally transformed. Mitanni was reduced to a fragment of its former power, its cities absorbed into a new Hittite order centered on Aleppo and Carchemish. Egypt, long accustomed to a dominant position along the Levantine coast and the Orontes corridor, suddenly found itself displaced and forced into new diplomatic strategies simply to maintain influence. And the Hittites, which only a generation earlier had hovered on the edge of collapse, re-enter the international arena as a premier great power. These achievements placed Suppiluliuma among the great generals and statesmen of the Late Bronze Age, a period already crowded with notable rulers. His campaigns did more than redraw boundaries. They reshaped the political logic of the Eastern Mediterranean. The confrontations that would define the 13th century, including the long arc that culminated at Kadesh between Mu'tali and Ramses the Great, were set in motion here, in these years of calculated aggression and rapid realignment. However we interpret the length and sequence of the wars, their impact is unmistakable. After Suppiluliuma's campaigns, Syria and the world around it would never be the same again.